The laundry basket sat innocently by our bedroom door, overflowing with Marcus's wrinkled dress shirts and expensive suits. I had always been the one to handle the washing, a small domestic ritual that I'd never questioned until that Tuesday morning when everything changed. As I sorted through his pockets, checking for forgotten pens or loose change, my fingers brushed against something that made my blood run cold. Hotel receipts. Not one, but 3 different luxury hotels across the span of 2 months. Hotels in cities where Marcus claimed he'd been attending boring corporate conferences, staying at company-approved budget chains. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first receipt was from the Meridian Grand in Charleston, dated exactly 3 weeks ago when he told me he was stuck in endless meetings about quarterly projections. 2 guests, champagne service, couples massage package. The second was from an intimate boutique hotel in Savannah, complete with room service charges for romantic dinners and late-night wine. The third made my hands shake as I read it. The Ritz-Carlton in Asheville, presidential suite, spa treatments for 2, charges that totaled more than my monthly salary. Standing there in our master bedroom, surrounded by the life we'd built together over 8 years of marriage, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Marcus wasn't just cheating on me. He was living an entirely separate existence, one filled with luxury getaways and romantic escapes while I stayed home, managing our household, caring for our 2 young children, and believing every lie that rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. The receipts told a story that shattered every assumption I'd held about our marriage. While I'd been packing his suitcases, kissing him goodbye at the front door, and fielding his nightly calls about exhausting client dinners and early morning presentations, he'd been building a fantasy world with someone else. Someone who enjoyed 5-star accommodations, premium spa treatments, and champagne toasts in cities I'd always dreamed of visiting but never had the chance to see. My mind raced back through the past few months, replaying every conversation, every excuse, every moment when I'd sensed something was off but had chosen to trust instead of investigate. The late-night phone calls he'd taken in his office with the door closed. The new cologne that appeared in our bathroom, something expensive and unfamiliar that he claimed was a client gift. The way he'd started working out religiously, buying new clothes, and paying attention to details about his appearance that had never mattered to him before. I sank onto our bed, the receipts spread out in front of me like evidence in a criminal case. The dates aligned perfectly with his supposed business trips. The locations matched the cities he'd mentioned in passing. But the charges, the romantic extras, the obvious signs of intimate getaways painted a picture that had nothing to do with corporate responsibilities and everything to do with betrayal. The woman's name wasn't on the receipts, but I knew she existed. Marcus wasn't the type to enjoy luxury alone, and the spa treatments for 2 made it clear that he'd been sharing these experiences with someone who mattered to him. Someone who was worth spending thousands of dollars on while I clipped coupons and worried about our mortgage payments. Someone who got to see the version of Marcus that I'd fallen in love with years ago, before responsibility and routine had dulled the edges of our relationship. 8 years of marriage had taught me to read the subtle signs of Marcus's moods, his tells, his patterns. I knew when he was stressed about work, when he was genuinely tired, when he was excited about a new project. But looking back now, I realized I'd been reading the signs all wrong. His improved mood after these trips wasn't relief from completing difficult work assignments. It was the satisfaction of a man living a double life, the excitement of someone who'd found a way to have everything he wanted without consequences. The children were at school, the house was quiet, and I had hours to process what I'd discovered before Marcus returned from his latest supposed business trip to Atlanta. According to his itinerary, which I'd helped him organize just 4 days ago, he was attending a 3-day conference on supply chain management. Boring, routine, the kind of professional obligation that paid our bills but offered no excitement. Yet as I sat there holding proof of his deception, I wondered what luxury hotel was hosting his real agenda. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus, sent from Atlanta as if to reinforce his cover story. The conference is running late tonight. Might not call until tomorrow. Miss you and the kids. The casual lie, delivered with the same tone he used to tell me he'd stopped for gas or picked up milk on his way home, felt like a physical blow. How many times had he sent similar messages while he was actually sharing intimate dinners and romantic evening walks with another woman? I stood up, folding the receipts carefully and placing them in my jewelry box, hidden beneath the pearls Marcus had given me for our 5th anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was hiding evidence of his betrayal behind a symbol of his supposed love and commitment. But I needed time to think, to plan, to decide how to respond to this revelation that had turned my entire world upside down. The house felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of what had been happening while I'd been playing the role of devoted wife and mother. Every family photo on the mantel, every shared memory we'd created, every moment of intimacy we'd shared, felt contaminated by his lies. Marcus had been living 2 separate lives, and I'd been nothing more than a supporting character in the mundane half of his existence. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else took its place. Not the crushing sadness I'd expected. Not the desperate need to confront him immediately and demand answers. Instead, I felt a cold, calculating clarity settling over me like armor. Marcus had made his choice to deceive me, to build his happiness on the foundation of my ignorance. Now it was time for me to make some choices of my own. The woman I'd been that morning, the trusting wife who sorted laundry and organized travel itineraries, was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that knowledge was power, that patience was a weapon, and that the best revenge wasn't served hot in a moment of emotional chaos. It was crafted carefully, precisely, with the kind of attention to detail that Marcus had put into hiding his affair. I walked to his home office, a space I'd always respected as his private domain, and sat down at his computer. Marcus was trusting to a fault when it came to passwords, using the same combination of our wedding date and his mother's maiden name for everything. Within minutes, I had access to his email accounts, his credit card statements, his calendar, and his entire digital life. The evidence was overwhelming. Email chains with someone named Sophia Chen, a marketing executive from a rival company who shared his taste for expensive restaurants and weekend getaways. Calendar entries that didn't match his official travel schedule. Blocked out time periods labeled with codes that now made perfect sense. Credit card charges that told the story of their relationship month by month, from initial dinner dates in our own city to elaborate romantic vacations in destinations I'd only seen in travel magazines. Sophia was beautiful, successful, and unattached according to her LinkedIn profile. She worked for Morrison Industries, one of Marcus's biggest competitors, which added a layer of professional recklessness to his personal betrayal. Their relationship had been going on for almost 6 months, hidden behind the convenient cover of his legitimate business travel and her own flexible schedule as a senior marketing director. The messages between them were nauseating in their intimacy, filled with inside jokes, shared memories, and plans for future trips. Marcus wrote to her with a passion and attention I hadn't seen directed toward me in years. He remembered details about her preferences, surprised her with thoughtful gifts, and spoke about their future together as if our marriage and family were minor obstacles to be navigated, rather than serious commitments he'd made. But the most devastating discovery was a message thread from just 2 weeks ago, where they discussed the possibility of Marcus leaving me after the children started college. Sophia had been patient, understanding, willing to wait for him to handle his domestic situation in a way that would minimize complications. They had been planning a future together while I'd been planning our summer vacation and organizing our anniversary dinner. I printed everything. Email conversations, credit card statements, hotel confirmations, restaurant receipts, even social media posts that placed them together in locations where Marcus had claimed to be alone on business. By early afternoon, I had compiled a comprehensive portfolio of their affair, organized chronologically and thoroughly documented. This wasn't just evidence of cheating. It was proof of a systematic deception that had infected every aspect of our marriage. The children would be home from school soon, and Marcus would return tomorrow evening with his usual collection of conference materials and client stories designed to reinforce his cover. He would kiss me hello, ask about my day, and seamlessly transition back into his role as devoted husband and father. The thought of watching him perform that act, knowing what I now knew, filled me with disgust, but I wouldn't confront him yet. Marcus had spent months carefully constructing his double life, believing he was smarter than me, more sophisticated, capable of managing both his marriage and his affair without consequences. He had underestimated me completely, assuming that my role as wife and mother had made me soft, trusting, and ultimately powerless. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. The plan began to form as I sat in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal. Marcus had built his deception on a foundation of lies about business travel, professional conferences, and work obligations. His affair with Sophia thrived in the gray areas of his legitimate career responsibilities, hidden behind the convenient excuse of corporate demands that I'd never questioned because I'd trusted him completely. But trust was a two-way street, and Marcus had been driving in the wrong direction for months. Now it was my turn to take control of the route. I started with Sophia's company. Morrison Industries was indeed a competitor, but they were also bound by strict ethical guidelines about employees fraternizing with personnel from rival firms. A carefully worded anonymous tip to their human resources department, supported by documentation of Sophia's relationship with Marcus, would raise questions about potential conflicts of interest and industrial espionage. Even if nothing criminal had occurred, the appearance of impropriety would be enough to make both companies very nervous about the relationship. Next, I turned my attention to Marcus's own employer. Henderson and Associates prided itself on integrity and family values, concepts that featured prominently in their marketing materials and corporate mission statement. The company had strict policies about employee conduct, particularly regarding relationships that might compromise business interests or reflect poorly on the firm's reputation. Marcus's affair with a competitor's executive, conducted on company time and possibly using company resources, would not align with their carefully cultivated image. But I needed to be strategic. Direct confrontation would give Marcus the opportunity to craft explanations, manipulate the narrative, and potentially minimize the consequences of his actions. Instead, I would let his own choices expose him, creating situations where his deception would unravel naturally while I maintained the appearance of innocence. The first step was subtle but effective. I called Marcus's assistant, Rachel, who had always been friendly and helpful whenever I'd needed to reach my husband during his travels. I explained that I was planning a surprise party for Marcus's upcoming promotion and needed to coordinate with some of his recent business contacts to invite them to the celebration. Rachel was delighted to help with what she assumed was a romantic gesture from a devoted wife. She provided me with detailed information about Marcus's recent trips, including the hotels where he'd supposedly stayed, the conferences he'd supposedly attended, and the clients he'd supposedly met. None of it matched the luxury accommodations and romantic getaways documented in the receipts I'd found. Armed with this information, I began making phone calls. The Charleston conference that Marcus had claimed to attend had actually been canceled due to weather. The Atlanta supply chain management event he was supposedly attending at that very moment was a one-day seminar that had ended 2 days earlier. The Seattle client meetings from last month had never been scheduled, according to the company he'd claimed to be visiting. Each lie I uncovered added another layer to the case I was building against Marcus. But more importantly, each discovered deception gave me additional ammunition for the plan that was taking shape in my mind. Marcus had constructed his affair carefully, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that I would never investigate, never question, never doubt the stories he told me about his professional obligations. The truth was that Marcus had been sloppy, overconfident in his ability to manage both his marriage and his affair without consequences. His lies were easily verifiable, his cover stories were full of holes, and his digital trail was embarrassingly obvious to anyone who bothered to look. He'd been counting on my trust, my distraction with domestic responsibilities, and my general lack of interest in his work travel to keep his secret safe. But now I had more than just evidence of his affair. I had proof that he'd been defrauding his own company, using business travel allowances for personal romantic getaways, billing client entertainment expenses for intimate dinners with his mistress, and lying about his whereabouts to both his employer and his family. The scope of his deception was staggering. Marcus wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a corporate fraudster who'd been stealing from his own company to finance his affair. The revelation should have devastated me, but instead, It energized me. Marcus had given me everything I needed to destroy the carefully constructed life he'd built on lies and betrayal. I spent the rest of the afternoon crafting the perfect strategy. Not an emotional confrontation that would give him the chance to manipulate and gaslight me, but a systematic exposure that would let his own actions speak for themselves. By the time the children came home from school, I had transformed from betrayed wife into strategic mastermind, ready to turn Marcus's own weapons against him. The next morning, I began implementing the plan that would unravel Marcus's double life with the same precision he'd used to construct it. But unlike his deception, which was built on lies and betrayal, my strategy was founded on truth, documentation, and the kind of patience that comes from understanding that the best revenge is served when your opponent least expects it. Marcus had spent months thinking he was cleverer than everyone around him. He was about to discover just how wrong he'd been. I started with a credit card company, calling to report suspicious charges on our joint account. The customer service representative was sympathetic and helpful, as I explained that I'd noticed several large expenses at luxury hotels and restaurants in cities where my husband had been traveling for work. I wasn't accusing anyone of fraud, I explained carefully, but the charges seemed inconsistent with his usual business travel patterns, and I wanted to make sure our account hadn't been compromised. The representative flagged the charges for investigation and promised to send detailed statements documenting every transaction. More importantly, they noted the discrepancy in my file and suggested that any future unusual charges should be reported immediately. This created an official record of my concerns and established a timeline that would become crucial later. Next, I called our financial advisor under the guise of planning for our upcoming anniversary. I mentioned that I wanted to surprise Marcus with a romantic getaway, but needed to understand our available discretionary spending, given his recent increase in business travel expenses. The advisor pulled up our accounts and confirmed what I already knew. The luxury hotel charges and expensive restaurant bills had been significantly impacting our budget. But the conversation served another purpose. It established that I was unaware of the true nature of Marcus's spending, and created another witness to the financial impact of his affair. When the truth eventually came to light, there would be no question that I had been deceived about both the extent and the purpose of these expenses. The psychological warfare began that evening, when Marcus returned from his latest fake business trip. He walked through the door carrying a small gift bag and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just spent 3 days living his ideal life. He kissed me hello, asked about the children, and handed me a bottle of expensive wine that he claimed to have picked up at the Atlanta airport. I accepted the gift graciously, even though I knew from his credit card statements that he'd actually purchased it at a romantic restaurant in Asheville, where he'd dined with Sophia the night before. The casual lie, delivered with such practiced ease, strengthened my resolve to continue with the plan I'd set in motion. Over dinner, Marcus regaled us with stories about the supply chain conference, describing fictional presentations and imaginary networking events, with the kind of detail that suggested he'd prepared his cover story in advance. He complained about the boring hotel, the terrible conference food, and the exhausting schedule of meetings and seminars. Every word was a carefully crafted lie, designed to reinforce his image as a dedicated professional who sacrificed personal comfort for career advancement. I listened attentively, asked appropriate questions, and played the role of supportive wife while privately marveling at the depth of his deception. Marcus wasn't just lying about having an affair. He was creating elaborate fictional narratives about his experiences, complete with invented characters and imaginary events. The level of creativity required to maintain such detailed lies was almost impressive, if it hadn't been so personally devastating. After the children went to bed, Marcus retreated to his office to catch up on email, a routine that had never seemed suspicious until now. I knew he was actually communicating with Sophia, probably sharing details about his successful return home and planning their next romantic getaway. The thought of him sitting in our house, using our internet connection to arrange his next betrayal, filled me with cold fury. But I maintained my composure, playing the part of oblivious wife while I prepared the next phase of my counterattack. Marcus had no idea that I'd discovered his secret, and his confidence in his ability to deceive me was about to become his greatest weakness. The following morning, I called his office and spoke with Rachel again, this time expressing concern about Marcus's health. I explained that he'd seemed exhausted and stressed since returning from his recent trips, and I was worried that his work schedule might be affecting his well-being. Rachel was sympathetic and promised to mention my concerns to their supervisor, inadvertently creating another data point in the growing record of discrepancies surrounding Marcus's travel claims. Then I made the call that would begin the systematic destruction of Marcus's carefully constructed double life. I contacted Henderson & Associates Human Resources Department and scheduled a confidential meeting to discuss concerns about potential misuse of company travel resources. I explained that I'd discovered some irregularities in my husband's travel expenses and wanted to ensure that the company wasn't being defrauded. The HR representative was professional and thorough, assuring me that they took such concerns seriously and would investigate quietly to protect all parties involved. They scheduled a meeting for the following week and requested that I bring any documentation that might be relevant to their investigation. I had plenty of documentation. That afternoon, I received a call from Morrison Industries' ethics hotline, responding to the anonymous tip I'd submitted about potential conflicts of interest involving one of their marketing executives. The representative explained that they were conducting a confidential investigation into possible violations of their employee conduct policies, and wanted to verify some information about meetings between their employee and personnel from competing firms. I played the part of confused spouse perfectly, expressing surprise that anyone from Morrison Industries might have been meeting with my husband professionally. As far as I knew, Marcus worked exclusively with their established client base and didn't have any business relationships with their competitors. The representative thanked me for my cooperation and assured me that they would handle the matter discreetly. By the end of the week, I had set multiple investigations in motion while maintaining the appearance of complete innocence. Marcus continued his routine of fake business trips and elaborate cover stories, unaware that his entire world was about to collapse around him. He was so confident in his ability to deceive me that he never suspected I might be capable of strategic thinking beyond managing our household and raising our children. The first crack in his facade appeared the following Monday when Rachel called to inform Marcus that their supervisor wanted to meet with him about some questions regarding his recent travel reports. Marcus assured her it was probably just routine administrative follow-up, but I could see the slight tension in his shoulders as he ended the call. The second crack appeared on Wednesday when Sophia's calls became more frequent and Marcus's responses became more cautious. He'd step outside to take her calls or retreat to his office with the door closed, behavior that would have seemed suspicious to me if I hadn't already known exactly what was happening. From their hushed conversations, I gathered that Sophia was also facing questions at work about her recent travel patterns and professional relationships. The third crack appeared on Friday morning when Marcus received a call from our credit card company requesting verification of several recent charges. He handled the call calmly, confirming the transactions and providing explanations about business travel expenses, but his hand was shaking slightly as he hung up the phone. Marcus was beginning to realize that his carefully constructed lies were being examined from multiple angles, but he still believed he could manage the situation. He had no idea that I was the source of all his mounting problems, that every question being asked and every investigation being conducted had been orchestrated by the wife he'd dismissed as naive and trusting. That weekend, Marcus was unusually attentive, suggesting we plan a special dinner together and spending extra time with the children. I recognized the behavior from previous occasions, when he'd felt guilty about his deception. But this time, his guilt seemed tinged with anxiety, as if he sensed that his control over the situation was slipping. Sunday evening, Sophia called while we were having family dinner. Marcus declined the call quickly, claiming it was a work issue that could wait until Monday. But 20 minutes later, she called again, and then again. By the third call, Marcus was visibly agitated, finally answering with a sharp whisper and immediately stepping outside to continue the conversation. When he returned, he announced that he had to travel to Boston the following week for an unexpected client emergency. The story was delivered with less confidence than usual, and he avoided making eye contact as he explained the sudden change to his schedule. I knew from monitoring their email communications that Sophia was pressuring him to meet in person so they could coordinate their responses to the questions they were both facing at work. But Boston would never happen. By Monday morning, Marcus would discover that his carefully constructed world of lies and deception had finally collapsed completely. The investigation I'd set in motion was about to reach its conclusion, and the man who'd spent months believing he was smarter than everyone around him was about to face the consequences of his choices. The final phase of my plan was elegant in its simplicity. I didn't need to destroy Marcus directly. I just needed to step back and let his own actions destroy him while I maintained the perfect image of shocked, betrayed wife who'd been completely unaware of his double life. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that suggested change was in the air. Marcus left for work with his usual routine, kissing me goodbye and promising to call later about his upcoming Boston trip. He had no idea that this would be the last normal morning of his carefully constructed double life. At 9:30, his supervisor called him into a closed-door meeting to discuss irregularities in his travel expense reports. The company had discovered that several of his recent trips didn't align with the conferences and client meetings he'd claimed to attend. Moreover, the luxury accommodations and romantic dining expenses were inconsistent with company policy and raised questions about the true purpose of his travels. At 10:15, Henderson & Associates' Human Resources Department presented Marcus with evidence of his fraudulent expense claims and demanded an explanation for the discrepancies between his reported activities and his actual whereabouts during company-funded trips. They had documentation proving that he'd lied about conferences, fabricated client meetings, and used corporate resources to finance personal romantic getaways. At 11:30, Marcus received a call from Sophia informing him that Morrison Industries had terminated her employment due to violations of their ethics policy regarding relationships with competitors. The company had evidence of their affair and had concluded that her relationship with Marcus represented a potential security risk and conflict of interest that couldn't be tolerated. By noon, Marcus was sitting in his car in the Henderson & Associates parking lot, officially suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct and potential termination for cause. His affair had been exposed, his professional reputation was destroyed, and his financial future was in jeopardy. Everything he'd built through years of careful career advancement had collapsed in the span of 3 hours. I received his call at 12:45. Marcus's voice was shaky as he tried to explain that there had been some kind of misunderstanding at work, that questions had been raised about his travel expenses, and that he might need to come home early to sort things out. He was still trying to manage the narrative, still hoping he could control the situation and minimize the damage to his personal life. I responded with exactly the right amount of concern and confusion, asking questions that demonstrated my complete ignorance of his affair, while expressing worry about how these work problems might affect our family. I was the perfect supportive wife, ready to stand by her husband during a difficult professional crisis. But Marcus wasn't finished facing consequences. At 2:30, he received another call, this time from our mortgage company. They'd been contacted by our credit card company as part of their fraud investigation and had questions about several large charges that might indicate identity theft or unauthorized use of our joint account. The mortgage company wanted to verify our financial stability given the unusual spending patterns they'd been alerted to. At 3:15, Marcus's phone rang again. This time it was our financial advisor, calling to discuss the impact of his recent increased spending on our long-term financial planning. The advisor had reviewed our accounts at my request and had some concerns about our ability to meet our savings goals given the current rate of discretionary expenses. By 4 o'clock, Marcus realized that every aspect of his life was being scrutinized simultaneously. His professional conduct was under investigation, his financial activities were being questioned, and his personal relationships were being examined from multiple angles. The perfect storm of consequences I'd orchestrated was converging on him from every direction. When he finally came home that evening, Marcus looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in a single day. He was pale, shaken, and obviously struggling to process the rapid collapse of everything he'd worked to build and protect. He sat at our kitchen table and tried to explain what had happened, spinning a story about false accusations and workplace politics while avoiding any mention of Sophia or the true nature of his travels. I listened with appropriate concern, asked sympathetic questions, and offered my full support in helping him fight these unfair allegations. I was the perfect wife, standing by her husband during his moment of crisis, ready to believe his explanations and defend him against his accusers. But privately, I was savoring every moment of his downfall. Marcus had spent months thinking he was cleverer than me, more sophisticated, capable of managing both his marriage and his affair without consequences. He dismissed me as naive and trusting, assuming that my focus on family and domestic responsibilities had made me incapable of strategic thinking or meaningful retaliation. He'd been wrong about everything. The next morning brought fresh revelations as Marcus's world continued to unravel with the relentless efficiency I'd designed into my plan. Henderson and Associates called to inform him that their investigation had uncovered evidence of expense fraud totaling over $40,000 in unauthorized charges over the past 6 months. They were terminating his employment immediately and considering whether to pursue criminal charges. Marcus tried to maintain his composure as he received the news, but I could see the panic setting in as he realized the full scope of what was happening to him. His career was over, his professional reputation was destroyed, and he was facing potential legal consequences for his fraudulent activity. But the financial implications were just the beginning. By noon, Marcus had received calls from 3 different attorneys representing Henderson and Associates, Morrison Industries, and our credit card company. Each was demanding documentation, explanations, and cooperation with ongoing investigations into his conduct and financial activities. The stress was visible in every aspect of Marcus's demeanor. His hands shook as he tried to make phone calls, his voice cracked when he attempted to explain the situation to potential legal representation, and his confident facade crumbled as he realized that his lies had created a web of legal and financial problems that he couldn't talk his way out of. That evening, Marcus finally broke. Sitting in our living room, surrounded by legal documents and facing the complete destruction of everything he'd built, he confessed to the affair. Through tears and desperate apologies, he admitted to his relationship with Sophia, his lies about business travel, and his fraudulent use of company resources to finance their romantic getaways. But even in his confession, Marcus was still trying to manipulate the situation. He claimed that the affair had been a mistake, that he'd never meant for it to go so far, and that he'd been planning to end it before anyone got hurt. He begged for my forgiveness, promised to do anything to save our marriage, and swore that he would spend the rest of his life making up for his betrayal. I responded with the shocked devastation that any betrayed wife would feel, expressing my disbelief and heartbreak while struggling to process the magnitude of his deception. I was the perfect victim, wounded but willing to consider reconciliation if Marcus could prove his commitment to rebuilding our relationship. But Marcus's problems were far from over. The legal investigations were proceeding regardless of his personal remorse, and the financial consequences of his fraud were mounting daily. Henderson and Associates was pursuing full restitution for the money he'd stolen. His professional licenses were under review, and several potential employers had already declined to consider him for positions after learning about the circumstances of his termination. More importantly, Marcus still didn't understand the true scope of what had happened to him. He believed that his affair had been discovered through routine corporate oversight and unfortunate coincidences. He had no idea that every investigation, every question, and every consequence had been orchestrated by the wife he'd dismissed as powerless and naive. 3 weeks later, Marcus was facing bankruptcy, unemployment, and potential criminal charges, while I was quietly consulting with divorce attorneys and financial planners about protecting my interests and those of our children. Marcus had destroyed his own life through his choices, but I had ensured that his destruction would be complete and irreversible. The woman who'd found hotel receipts in her husband's laundry was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true justice required patience, strategy, and the kind of calculated precision that Marcus had mistaken for domestic simplicity. He'd underestimated me completely, and that mistake had cost him everything he'd valued more than his family. As I watched Marcus struggle with the consequences of his own actions, I felt no guilt or regret about the role I'd played in his downfall. He'd made his choices, built his deceptions, and assumed that he could betray his family without facing meaningful consequences. I had simply ensured that he was wrong about that assumption. The hotel receipts had revealed more than just an affair. They'd exposed the fundamental dishonesty that had infected every aspect of Marcus's life, from his professional conduct to his personal relationships. My response had been measured, strategic, and ultimately devastating. because it had been built on truth rather than deception. Marcus had gambled everything on his ability to maintain his double life indefinitely. He'd lost that gamble not because he'd been unlucky, but because he'd underestimated the intelligence, patience, and strategic capability of the woman whose trust he'd betrayed. In the end, the hotel receipts hadn't just documented his affair. They'd provided the foundation for the most effective revenge possible, allowing Marcus to destroy himself with his own choices, while I remained the innocent victim who'd been powerless to prevent his downfall. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't about dramatic confrontations or emotional outbursts. It was about ensuring that the consequences of someone's actions finally caught up with them in a way that left no room for escape, manipulation, or redemption. Marcus had written his own ending through his choices. I had simply made sure that ending was as thorough and irreversible as the betrayal that had started it all. The bankruptcy attorney's office smelled of leather and desperation. Marcus sat across from me in the mahogany-paneled conference room, his once pristine appearance now disheveled and worn. The expensive suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing from discount stores, his confident posture reduced to a hunched, defensive slouch. 3 months had passed since his world collapsed, and the transformation was remarkable to witness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Our attorney, Patricia Hawthorne, was explaining the intricacies of asset protection during bankruptcy proceedings, while Marcus's lawyer, a young public defender named Kevin Mills, took frantic notes and asked increasingly desperate questions. The contrast between our legal representation told the entire story of how dramatically our circumstances had shifted. Patricia was a partner at the city's most prestigious family law firm, while Kevin was fresh out of law school and handling Marcus's case pro bono, because Marcus could no longer afford private counsel. The financial forensics team Patricia had hired had done their work thoroughly. Every fraudulent expense, every misappropriated company fund, every dollar Marcus had stolen to finance his affair with Sophia had been documented, categorized, and traced. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Marcus owed Henderson and Associates $47,000 in restitution, faced potential criminal charges for embezzlement, and was personally liable for the credit card debt he'd accumulated during his romantic escapades. But the most devastating revelation came when Patricia presented the asset evaluation report. Our house, which we'd purchased 8 years ago and had been steadily paying down, was now entirely in my name due to a legal maneuver I'd executed weeks earlier. While Marcus had been scrambling to find new employment and fighting the fraud charges, I'd been working with Patricia to protect our family's assets from his creditors. The process had been surprisingly straightforward. Given Marcus's obvious financial instability and the mounting evidence of his fraudulent activities, the court had been receptive to my petition for emergency asset protection. I demonstrated that Marcus's criminal behavior posed a direct threat to our children's financial security, and that immediate action was necessary to prevent further damage to our family's economic foundation. Marcus's face went white as Patricia explained that the house, our joint savings accounts, and even his retirement fund were now legally protected from his creditors because they'd been transferred into a trust established for the children's benefit. The irony was perfect. Marcus's betrayal had not only destroyed his own life, but had also provided the legal justification for removing him from any claim to the assets he'd helped build during our marriage. Kevin Mills shuffled through his papers nervously, clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of the case and his client's increasingly hopeless position. He asked Patricia about the possibility of negotiating a settlement that would allow Marcus to retain some portion of his assets, but her response was swift and definitive. Given the extent of Marcus's fraud and the ongoing criminal investigation, any attempt to shield assets from creditors would be viewed as additional criminal activity. The meeting concluded with Patricia handing Marcus a formal notice of my intention to file for divorce on grounds of adultery and financial misconduct. The papers outlined my requests for full custody of the children, complete control of all marital assets, and Marcus's responsibility for all debts incurred during his affair. It was a comprehensive legal strategy designed to ensure that Marcus would leave our marriage with nothing while bearing full responsibility for the consequences of his choices. Marcus tried to speak to me as we left the attorney's office, his voice cracking as he pleaded for a private conversation. He wanted to explain, to apologize, to somehow convince me that our marriage could survive this catastrophe. But I maintained the cool composure I'd perfected over the past months, expressing my willingness to communicate only through our attorneys and for the sake of our children's well-being. The drive home was silent, Marcus following behind me in the used Honda he'd been forced to buy after his BMW was repossessed. I watched him in my rearview mirror, noting how his shoulders sagged with defeat and how frequently he wiped his eyes. The confident, successful man I'd married had been replaced by a broken shell who could barely manage the basic requirements of daily existence. At home, the children greeted us with the innocent enthusiasm that had become increasingly precious as their father's world crumbled around them. 8-year-old Emma showed us her latest art project while 6-year-old James demonstrated his improving basketball skills in the driveway. They were too young to fully understand why Daddy had been so sad lately, or why Mommy had been having so many serious phone calls with important-sounding people. I'd been careful to shield them from the worst aspects of Marcus's downfall, maintaining as much normalcy as possible, while quietly preparing for our new life as a single-parent family. The children knew that Daddy was having problems at work and that some changes might be coming, but they remained secure in the love of both parents and the stability of their home environment. Marcus retreated to what had once been his office but was now little more than a storage room, where he kept his legal documents and job search materials. He'd been applying for positions relentlessly, but his professional reputation had been destroyed so thoroughly that even entry-level jobs were rejecting his applications. Word had spread quickly through our industry about his fraudulent activities and affair with a competitor's executive, making him essentially unemployable in his chosen field. The psychological impact of his professional exile was evident in every aspect of Marcus's behavior. He'd always defined himself through his career success, his ability to provide for our family, and his status within the business community. Without those external validations, he seemed lost, unsure of his identity or his place in the world. The confidence that had once been his defining characteristic had been replaced by anxiety, depression, and a desperate need for reassurance that rarely came. But my sympathy for Marcus's suffering was limited by my growing understanding of the depth of his betrayal. The private investigator Patricia had recommended had uncovered additional evidence of his deception that went far beyond his affair with Sophia. Marcus had been living a double life for years, maintaining fake social media profiles, conducting inappropriate relationships with multiple women, and systematically lying about his activities and whereabouts. The Sophia affair hadn't been an aberration or a moment of weakness. It had been the culmination of a pattern of dishonesty and infidelity that stretched back to the early years of our marriage. Marcus was a serial cheater who'd simply become more sophisticated in his deception over time, using business travel and professional obligations as cover for increasingly elaborate romantic adventures. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Hotel receipts from trips I'd never known about, restaurant charges from intimate dinners with women whose names I didn't recognize, gifts purchased for lovers I'd never suspected existed. Marcus had been building relationships with other women throughout our entire marriage, while I'd been faithfully raising our children and managing our household. Each new revelation made it easier to proceed with the systematic destruction of Marcus's life without guilt or regret. He hadn't made a single mistake or experienced a temporary lapse in judgment. He'd been deliberately and methodically betraying our family for years, financing his infidelities with money that should have been used for our children's education, our mortgage payments, and our retirement savings. The criminal case against Marcus was proceeding slowly but steadily toward what appeared to be an inevitable conviction. The prosecutor had assigned an experienced white-collar crime specialist to the case, and she'd made it clear that Marcus's cooperation in recovering the stolen funds would be the only factor that might reduce his sentence. Unfortunately for Marcus, most of the money had been spent on experiences rather than assets, making restitution nearly impossible. Henderson and Associates had been thorough in their pursuit of justice, hiring a team of forensic accountants to trace every dollar Marcus had stolen and demanding full restitution plus interest and penalties. The company's position was that Marcus's fraud had damaged their reputation and client relationships, making him liable not only for the money he'd taken, but also for the business losses his actions had caused. The civil lawsuit was proceeding in parallel with the criminal case, creating a complex web of legal challenges that Marcus's overwhelmed attorney was struggling to manage. Kevin Mills had suggested that Marcus consider pleading guilty to the criminal charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. But even that strategy would leave Marcus facing years in prison and financial obligations he could never hope to fulfill. Meanwhile, Morrison Industries had filed their own lawsuit against both Marcus and Sophia, claiming that their relationship had compromised sensitive business information and damaged the company's competitive position. They were seeking damages for industrial espionage and breach of fiduciary duty, adding another layer of legal complexity to Marcus's mounting problems. Sophia had disappeared from our city entirely, relocating to another state and cutting all contact with Marcus as soon as her own legal troubles began. The woman who'd shared romantic getaways and intimate dinners with my husband had abandoned him the moment their affair became a liability rather than an adventure. Marcus's calls to her went unanswered, his emails were returned undelivered, and his attempts to reach her through mutual acquaintances were rebuffed. The abandonment by his mistress seemed to affect Marcus almost as deeply as the legal and financial consequences of his actions. He genuinely believed that Sophia cared for him, that their relationship was built on something more substantial than convenience and excitement. Her immediate disappearance when he needed support revealed the shallow nature of their connection, and forced Marcus to confront the reality that he'd destroyed his marriage for an illusion. I watched Marcus's decline with a mixture of satisfaction and clinical interest, studying the psychology of a man who'd lost everything he'd valued through his own choices. He'd been so confident in his ability to manage multiple relationships and maintain his carefully constructed lies that he'd never considered the possibility of complete exposure and total consequences. The children began noticing their father's deteriorating condition as his depression deepened and his anxiety became more visible. Emma asked me why Daddy seemed so sad all the time, while James wondered if Daddy was sick because he looked so tired and worried. I provided age-appropriate explanations that acknowledged their father's struggles without revealing the true nature of his problems. Marcus's relationship with the children became one of the few bright spots in his increasingly dark world. He cherished the time he spent with Emma and James, playing games, helping with homework, and reading bedtime stories with an intensity that suggested he understood how precious these moments had become. The possibility of losing regular access to his children through the divorce proceedings seemed to motivate him more than the threat of prison or financial ruin. But even his parenting was compromised by his legal troubles and emotional instability. Marcus was distracted during family activities, frequently checking his phone for updates from his attorney or responses to his job applications. His mood swings were unpredictable, alternating between forced cheerfulness and barely concealed despair. The children were beginning to walk on eggshells around their father, unsure of what might trigger his next emotional outburst. The custody evaluation ordered by the family court painted a disturbing picture of Marcus's fitness as a parent. The psychologist assigned to the case noted his criminal legal troubles, his history of deception, his financial instability, and his apparent inability to maintain emotional equilibrium under stress. While Marcus clearly loved his children and had been an involved father before his world collapsed, his current circumstances made him a potential risk to their emotional and physical well-being. Patricia used the custody evaluation as additional ammunition in our divorce proceedings, arguing that Marcus's criminal behavior and psychological instability made supervised visitation the only appropriate arrangement for protecting the children's interests. The request was strategically brilliant, designed not only to limit Marcus's access to Emma and James, but also to reinforce the narrative that he was fundamentally unfit to be trusted with important responsibilities. Marcus's attorney objected strenuously to the supervised visitation request, arguing that his client's mistakes in his professional and marital life didn't necessarily translate to deficiencies as a parent. But the evidence was overwhelming. A man who'd systematically lied to his family, stolen money from his employer, and conducted multiple affairs over several years, had demonstrated a pattern of poor judgment and dishonesty that called into question his ability to provide appropriate guidance and stability for young children. The supervised visitation order was particularly devastating because it required Marcus to pay for the professional oversight of his time with Emma and James. Given his current financial situation, this effectively limited his parenting time to whatever he could afford, creating another way in which his fraudulent activities continued to damage his relationship with his children. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's attempts to finance his affairs through theft had ultimately cost him access to the family he claimed to love. Every dollar he'd spent on luxury hotels with Sophia was now a dollar less he could spend on supervised visits with his own children. His selfishness had created a self-reinforcing cycle of consequences that grew more severe with each passing week. As winter approached, Marcus's situation continued to deteriorate at an almost mathematical pace. His unemployment benefits had been denied due to the circumstances of his termination, leaving him entirely dependent on odd jobs and temporary work that barely covered his basic living expenses. The small apartment he'd been forced to rent in a declining neighborhood was a stark contrast to the comfortable suburban home where his children continued to live with me. The psychological toll of his downfall was becoming increasingly visible. Marcus had lost weight, his hair was graying rapidly, and his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. The confident executive who'd once commanded respect in boardrooms and social gatherings had been replaced by a nervous, desperate man who jumped at unexpected sounds and avoided eye contact during conversations. His attempts to rebuild his professional reputation were met with consistent rejection and occasional cruelty. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid speaking with him, networking events became exercises in humiliation, and job interviews ended abruptly when employers recognized his name from news coverage of his criminal case. The local business community had effectively blacklisted Marcus, viewing his fraud and affair as breaches of trust that extended beyond his specific crimes. In a city where professional relationships were built on reputation and personal integrity, Marcus's scandals had made him a pariah who represented everything the business establishment claimed to oppose. The media attention surrounding Marcus's case had been minimal, but devastating. A brief article in the business section of the local newspaper had identified him as a former Henderson and Associates executive who'd been charged with embezzlement and fraud. The article mentioned his affair with a competitor's employee and the circumstances that had led to his discovery and termination. That single article had been enough to ensure that Marcus's professional disgrace would follow him indefinitely. Potential employers could easily search his name online and find detailed information about his criminal charges, his fraudulent activities, and his personal scandals. The digital age had made rehabilitation nearly impossible for someone whose crimes had been documented so thoroughly. Marcus began drinking more heavily as his depression deepened, and his prospects for recovery dimmed. I could smell alcohol on his breath during our brief encounters, and the children mentioned that Daddy seemed funny during their phone conversations. The supervised visitation supervisor reported that Marcus appeared to be under the influence during one of his scheduled visits, leading to the temporary suspension of his parenting time pending a substance abuse evaluation. The descent into alcoholism was predictable but nonetheless tragic to witness. Marcus had always been a social drinker who enjoyed wine with dinner and cocktails at business functions, but his current consumption was clearly medicinal rather than recreational. He was drinking to numb the pain of his losses and to escape the reality of his circumstances, but the alcohol was only accelerating his downward spiral. The substance abuse evaluation confirmed what had become obvious to everyone around Marcus. He was drinking heavily on a daily basis, using alcohol to manage his anxiety and depression, and showing signs of developing a serious addiction. The evaluator recommended immediate treatment in a residential program, but Marcus couldn't afford the cost of private rehabilitation, and the waiting list for public programs was several months long. Patricia used the substance abuse evaluation as additional evidence that Marcus was unfit for unsupervised contact with the children. She argued that his drinking problem, combined with his criminal legal troubles and financial instability, created an environment that posed serious risks to Emma and James's safety and well-being. The family court judge agreed, suspending Marcus's visitation rights entirely until he could demonstrate 6 months of sobriety and complete a court-approved parenting education program. The order was another devastating blow to Marcus's already fragile psychological state, removing his primary source of motivation and emotional support during his darkest period. I felt no sympathy for Marcus as he faced the loss of access to his children. His drinking was a choice, just like his affairs and his fraudulent activities had been choices. He was experiencing the natural consequences of decisions he'd made as an adult, and those consequences needed to be severe enough to prevent him from causing further harm to innocent people. The children were confused and hurt by their father's sudden absence from their lives, but I explained that Daddy was sick and needed to get better before he could spend time with them again. It was a truthful explanation that protected them from the harsh realities of their father's criminal behavior and substance abuse, while preparing them for the possibility that he might never recover enough to be a reliable presence in their lives. Christmas approached with a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The holiday season had always been Marcus's favorite time of year, and his absence was noticeable in every family tradition and celebration. But there was also a peace in our home that hadn't existed during the months of legal battles, financial stress, and emotional turmoil that had defined our lives since Marcus's exposure. The children adapted to their father's absence with the resilience that young people often display during family crises. They missed him and asked about him regularly, but they also seemed to sense that our home was calmer and more stable without his presence. The constant tension that had accompanied Marcus's legal troubles and emotional instability had dissipated, leaving space for the simple pleasures of family life. On Christmas morning, Emma and James opened their presents with enthusiasm, apparently unburdened by their father's absence. I'd been careful to maintain their usual holiday traditions and gift expectations, using the financial security that Patricia's legal strategies had protected to ensure that Marcus's problems didn't diminish their childhood experiences. The irony was perfect. Marcus's theft and fraud had been motivated by his desire to finance luxury experiences with other women, but his crimes had ultimately resulted in his own children enjoying a more comfortable and stable life because his creditors couldn't touch the assets I'd moved into protective trusts. Later that morning, Marcus called to speak with the children, his voice thick with emotion and alcohol as he tried to maintain a cheerful tone while wishing them a Merry Christmas. Emma and James dutifully spoke with their father, but the conversation was stilted and brief. They were excited about their new toys and eager to return to their holiday activities rather than dwelling on their father's sadness. After the children hung up, I sat in our living room surrounded by wrapping paper and the comfortable chaos of Christmas morning, reflecting on how dramatically our lives had changed since I'd discovered those hotel receipts in Marcus's laundry. The woman who'd sorted his clothes and trusted his explanations was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came from protecting your family from people who would harm them, even when those people shared your name and your history. Marcus had made his choices, and those choices had consequences that extended far beyond his own life. He'd gambled with his family's security and his children's future, and he'd lost that gamble completely. The fact that he was now suffering didn't erase the damage he'd caused or justify forgiveness that would only enable further harm. The new year arrived with the promise of fresh starts and new beginnings. But for Marcus, it brought only the continuation of consequences that showed no signs of diminishing. His criminal trial was scheduled for early spring, his divorce proceedings were moving toward a conclusion that would leave him with nothing, and his attempts at rehabilitation had been unsuccessful due to his continued drinking and emotional instability. I began making plans for our future as a single-parent family, researching schools in better districts, considering career opportunities that would provide greater financial security, and building relationships with other families who could provide social support for the children and myself. The life I was constructing from the ashes of my marriage was better in every measurable way than the life I'd been living while Marcus was systematically betraying us. The children were thriving in ways that surprised even me. Without the constant tension of their parents' deteriorating relationship and their father's legal troubles, Emma and James were more confident, more creative, and more emotionally available for the relationships and activities that truly mattered to them. They'd stopped walking on eggshells and started walking with purpose toward futures that were no longer constrained by their father's poor choices. As I watched my children flourish in our newly peaceful home, I realized that Marcus's betrayal had ultimately been a gift. It had forced me to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed, to develop skills I'd never needed to cultivate, and to build a life that was entirely my own rather than a supporting role in someone else's story. The hotel receipts that had started this journey were still in my jewelry box, tucked beneath the pearls that Marcus had given me during happier times. But they no longer represented betrayal and heartbreak. They had become symbols of transformation, evidence of my ability to turn devastating discovery into strategic victory. Marcus had underestimated me completely, assuming that his intelligence and sophistication would always be superior to my domestic simplicity. He'd been wrong about that, just as he'd been wrong about his ability to maintain his deceptions indefinitely. His arrogance had been his downfall, and my supposed naivete had been my greatest weapon. The woman who'd discovered those receipts had been trusting and vulnerable, but she'd also been intelligent and observant enough to recognize the truth when it was placed in front of her. More importantly, she'd been strong enough to act on that truth in ways that protected her family and ensured that justice was served completely. Marcus's story was ending in disgrace, isolation, and consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. My story was just beginning, built on a foundation of truth, strength, and the kind of strategic thinking that had proven more powerful than any deception he could devise. The hotel receipts had revealed his secrets, but they'd also revealed my own capacity for transformation and triumph. In the end, Marcus had taught me everything I needed to know about the difference between appearing strong and actually being strong. He'd spent years crafting an image of success and sophistication, while systematically undermining the foundation of his own life. I'd spent months quietly building real strength, real security, and real victory from the pieces of the life he'd tried to destroy. The receipts were proof of his betrayal, but they'd also become proof of my resilience. And that made all the difference. The courtroom smelled of old wood and institutional cleaning products, its high ceilings and formal atmosphere designed to intimidate those who found themselves facing judgment. Marcus sat at the defendant's table wearing an ill-fitting gray suit that had clearly been purchased at a discount store, his shoulders hunched forward in defeat. The confident executive who had once commanded boardrooms was now a broken man awaiting sentencing for crimes that had destroyed everything he'd once valued. I occupied a seat in the gallery reserved for victims' families, watching as the prosecutor methodically presented evidence of Marcus's fraudulent activities to the judge. The financial records, hotel receipts, and falsified expense reports told a clear story of systematic theft and deception that had continued for months, while Marcus lived a double life financed by stolen corporate funds. The prosecution's case was overwhelming in its thoroughness. Every fraudulent transaction had been documented. Every lie had been exposed, and every attempt Marcus had made to cover his tracks had been traced and verified. The forensic accountants testified about the sophisticated methods Marcus had used to hide his theft, describing a pattern of criminal behavior that demonstrated clear intent and premeditation rather than momentary lapses in judgment. Marcus's public defender, Kevin Mills, attempted to present mitigating circumstances that might reduce his client's sentence. He spoke about Marcus's previous clean record, his role as a father to 2 young children, and his apparent remorse for the harm his actions had caused. But the evidence of Marcus's crimes was so extensive, and his deception so thorough that the judge seemed unmoved by these arguments. The victim impact statements were particularly devastating. Henderson and Associates had provided detailed testimony about the damage Marcus's fraud had caused to their business relationships and corporate reputation. Several clients had terminated their contracts after learning about Marcus's criminal activities, resulting in hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenue that extended far beyond the money he had actually stolen. The company's human resources director testified about the impact Marcus's crimes had on employee morale and corporate trust. His colleagues had felt betrayed by his deception, questioning whether they could trust their own judgment about the people they worked with daily. The fraud had created a climate of suspicion and doubt that had required extensive counseling and team-building efforts to overcome. But the most powerful victim impact statement came from an unexpected source. Sophia Chen had agreed to testify via video conference from her new home in Seattle, where she'd relocated after losing her job at Morrison Industries. Her appearance was a shock to Marcus, who hadn't seen or spoken to his former mistress since her abrupt departure months earlier. Sophia's testimony was clinical and devastating. She described Marcus as a manipulative liar who had convinced her that his marriage was essentially over and that his frequent business trips were legitimate corporate obligations. She claimed that Marcus had portrayed himself as a successful executive with unlimited access to company resources for entertainment and travel, never revealing that he was actually stealing money to finance their relationship. The betrayal in Sophia's voice was unmistakable as she described discovering the true nature of Marcus's financial situation. She had believed she was involved with a wealthy, successful businessman who could afford luxury accommodations and expensive restaurants. Learning that their entire relationship had been financed through corporate theft had devastated her professionally and personally, resulting in the loss of her career and her relocation to another state to escape the scandal. Marcus tried to maintain his composure during Sophia's testimony, but I could see the pain in his eyes as the woman he'd destroyed his marriage for systematically demolished any remaining vestiges of their romantic relationship. Sophia's portrayal of Marcus as a pathetic, lying fraud who had deceived everyone around him was particularly brutal because it came from someone who had once professed to love him. The judge's questions for Sophia revealed the full extent of Marcus's deception. She had never known he was married when their relationship began, never understood that his children were unaware of her existence, and never realized that the money he spent on their relationship was stolen from his employer. Marcus had constructed elaborate lies for everyone in his life, creating separate fictional narratives that allowed him to maintain his affairs while preserving his marriage and his professional reputation. When Sophia's testimony concluded, Marcus looked completely defeated. The woman who had been his motivation for risking everything had publicly characterized him as a con artist and a fraud. Whatever romantic illusions he might have maintained about their relationship had been destroyed by her clinical assessment of his character and her complete rejection of any shared responsibility for his crimes. The judge took a brief recess before delivering Marcus's sentence, and I used the time to observe the man who had once been my husband. He sat alone at the defendant's table, abandoned by everyone who had once been part of his life. His attorney was gathering papers and preparing for the inevitable appeal, but even Kevin Mills seemed to understand that his client's fate was sealed. Marcus turned slightly in his chair, and our eyes met across the courtroom. For a moment I saw a flicker of the man I had married, the father of my children, the person I had once trusted with my heart and my future. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the recognition that this broken stranger was the real Marcus, revealed only after his carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely. When court reconvened, the judge delivered a sentence that exceeded even the prosecution's recommendations. Marcus was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation, with full restitution required to Henderson and Associates plus interest and penalties. The financial judgment alone would ensure that Marcus would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes, even after he completed his prison sentence. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly harsh, focusing on Marcus's betrayal of trust in multiple aspects of his life. She noted that his crimes had not been committed out of desperation or necessity, but out of greed and selfishness. Marcus had stolen money to finance a lifestyle he couldn't afford, deceiving his employer, his wife, and his mistress in pursuit of personal gratification that had ultimately benefited no one. More damaging was the judge's observation that Marcus had shown no genuine remorse for his actions, only regret at being caught and facing consequences. His attempts to minimize his responsibility and blame others for his situation demonstrated a fundamental lack of character that made rehabilitation unlikely without significant intervention. The sentence also included provisions that would affect Marcus's relationship with our children. He was prohibited from leaving the state without permission during his probation period, required to maintain steady employment to meet his restitution obligations, and subject to regular monitoring that would make it difficult for him to maintain any privacy or independence. As the judge's gavel fell and Marcus was led away in handcuffs, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that surprised me with its complexity. The man being taken to prison was someone who had betrayed me and our children in the most fundamental ways possible, but he was also the father of Emma and James, and the person I had once planned to spend my life with. The children were not present for the sentencing, and I had no intention of describing the details of their father's imprisonment to them. They knew that Daddy had made serious mistakes and would be away for a while, but they didn't need to understand the full scope of his crimes or the severity of his punishment until they were old enough to process such difficult realities. Outside the courthouse, Patricia expressed satisfaction with the outcome, while reminding me that our divorce proceedings were nearing their conclusion. Marcus's criminal conviction had eliminated any remaining leverage he might have had in our settlement negotiations, ensuring that my requests for full custody and asset protection would be granted without significant opposition. The divorce itself had become a formality, with Marcus's imprisonment making it impossible for him to contest any of the arrangements I had proposed. He would retain minimal parental rights that could be exercised only under supervised conditions when he was eventually released from prison, but the practical reality was that Emma and James would grow up primarily as my children rather than products of our failed marriage. The financial settlement was comprehensive and permanent. Marcus was responsible for all debts incurred during his affair, including the credit card charges, legal fees, and restitution payments to his former employer. I retained complete ownership of our house, our savings accounts, and the children's education funds, with additional protections that prevented Marcus from making any claims against these assets even after his release from prison. Patricia had structured the settlement to ensure that Marcus's financial obligations would continue indefinitely, making it impossible for him to rebuild his wealth or achieve financial independence without first satisfying his debts to me and our children. The arrangement was punitive by design, intended to ensure that Marcus would spend the rest of his life paying for the choices he had made during our marriage. The psychological evaluations required for the custody determination had painted an even more damaging picture of Marcus's character than I had expected. The court-appointed psychologist had identified patterns of narcissistic behavior, chronic dishonesty, and emotional instability that made Marcus unsuitable for significant parenting responsibilities, even under the best circumstances. The evaluation noted that Marcus had demonstrated a pattern of putting his own desires ahead of his family's well-being, showing little genuine empathy for the impact his actions had on others. His ability to maintain elaborate deceptions for extended periods suggested a level of psychological dysfunction that would make it difficult for him to provide appropriate guidance and stability for developing children. Most concerning was the psychologist's assessment that Marcus showed little evidence of genuine remorse or emotional growth following his exposure and conviction. His primary focus remained on his own suffering and losses rather than the harm he had caused to others, suggesting that he viewed himself as a victim rather than accepting responsibility as a perpetrator. The custody arrangement reflected these concerns, granting me full legal and physical custody, with provisions for supervised visitation, only after Marcus completed his prison sentence and demonstrated sustained sobriety and emotional stability. Even then, his access to Emma and James would be limited and monitored to ensure their safety and well-being. As spring turned to summer, our lives began to settle into new patterns that reflected our changed circumstances. The children adapted to their father's absence with remarkable resilience, focusing on school activities, friendships, and the stability of our newly peaceful home environment. They occasionally asked about Marcus and expressed sadness about his situation, but they also seemed to understand that his absence had eliminated much of the tension and uncertainty that had characterized our family life. I enrolled in evening courses at the local university, working toward a degree in business administration that would provide greater career opportunities and financial independence. The education was something I had always wanted to pursue, but had delayed due to family obligations and Marcus's career demands. His imprisonment had finally given me the freedom to invest in my own future rather than supporting his ambitions. The house felt different without Marcus's presence, lighter and more peaceful in ways that became more apparent as time passed. The children's friends were comfortable visiting and staying for meals, no longer worried about encountering Marcus during one of his increasingly frequent emotional outbursts or alcohol-fueled episodes. Emma and James began participating in activities that had been difficult to manage when Marcus's legal troubles and emotional instability dominated our household. Emma joined the school's art club and discovered a talent for painting that flourished in the supportive environment I was able to provide. James started playing soccer and made new friends who became regular fixtures in our home and our lives. The financial security that Patricia's legal strategies had protected allowed me to provide opportunities for the children that would have been impossible if Marcus's debts and legal obligations had been allowed to affect our assets. Music lessons, summer camps, educational trips, and other enrichment activities became possible because Marcus's poor choices no longer determined our family's economic circumstances. But the most significant change was in my own sense of identity and purpose. The woman who had discovered hotel receipts in her husband's laundry and felt her world collapse had been replaced by someone who understood her own strength, intelligence, and capability. I was no longer defined by my role as Marcus's wife or limited by his expectations and demands. The community's response to our situation had been overwhelmingly supportive, with neighbors, friends, and other parents rallying around our family during the difficult months of Marcus's legal troubles and imprisonment. Many people had suspected that something was wrong in our marriage long before I discovered the evidence of Marcus's betrayal, and they expressed admiration for the strength and dignity I had shown in protecting our children and rebuilding our lives. The local business community, which had shunned Marcus after his crimes were exposed, welcomed me as an independent individual with my own merits and potential. Former clients of Marcus's firm offered networking opportunities and business connections that would have been impossible to access as merely the wife of a disgraced executive. My evenings were spent studying, helping the children with homework, and planning for futures that were no longer constrained by Marcus's limitations or compromised by his poor judgment. The quiet satisfaction of building something positive from the ruins of our marriage was deeply fulfilling in ways that my previous role as supportive wife had never provided. 6 months into Marcus's imprisonment, I received a letter from him that revealed the depth of his continued self-deception and lack of genuine understanding about his situation. The letter was filled with complaints about prison conditions, expressions of self-pity about his circumstances, and requests for money to purchase commissary items and phone privileges that would allow him to maintain contact with the outside world. Most disturbing was Marcus's apparent belief that his imprisonment was a temporary setback rather than the natural consequence of his criminal behavior. He wrote about his plans for rebuilding his career after his release, his expectations that I would wait for him to return, and his assumption that our marriage could somehow survive his betrayal and conviction. The letter contained no genuine apology for the harm he had caused, no acknowledgement of the impact his crimes had on our children, and no recognition that his actions had been fundamentally wrong rather than merely unlucky. Marcus seemed to view his situation as a series of misunderstandings and bad breaks, rather than the inevitable result of choices he had made as an adult. I shared the letter with Patricia, who used it as additional evidence of Marcus's unsuitability for any meaningful role in our children's lives. The letter demonstrated that Marcus had learned nothing from his experience and remained focused on his own desires, rather than the well-being of his family. My response to Marcus's letter was brief and definitive. I informed him that our divorce would be finalized within weeks, that his parental rights would be severely limited even after his release, and that he should have no expectations of reconciliation or financial support from me or the children. The letter was cold and businesslike, reflecting the complete emotional detachment I had achieved from the man who had once been the center of my world. The children's response to receiving messages from their imprisoned father was mixed and evolved over time. Initially, they were excited to hear from Marcus and eager to maintain contact, despite his absence. But as months passed and his letters continued to focus on his own problems rather than their lives and achievements, their enthusiasm waned considerably. Emma and James began to understand, in age-appropriate ways, that their father's troubles were not temporary misfortunes but consequences of serious mistakes he had made. They stopped asking when he would come home and started making plans that didn't include his participation or presence. The final divorce hearing was anticlimactic, with Marcus participating via video conference from prison and offering no objection to any of the arrangements I had proposed. He looked older and more defeated than he had during his criminal trial, wearing prison clothing and speaking in the monotone voice of someone who had finally accepted that his life had been irreparably damaged by his own choices. The judge granted the divorce on grounds of adultery and financial misconduct, approving all of my requests regarding custody, asset division, and ongoing financial obligations. Marcus was officially transformed from husband and father to convicted felon, with minimal legal connection to the family he had betrayed. Walking out of the courthouse as a single woman, I felt a sense of completion that had been building throughout the long process of legal proceedings and personal transformation. The marriage that had defined so much of my adult life was officially over, but more importantly, the fear and uncertainty that had characterized the final years of that relationship had been replaced by confidence and self-determination. That evening, I celebrated quietly with the children, acknowledging that our family had officially become something new and different, but no less valuable than what we had been before. Emma and James seemed to understand that this day represented a new beginning rather than just an ending, and they approached our future with excitement rather than sadness. As autumn arrived, I began to receive occasional updates about Marcus's adjustment to prison life through the victim notification system that kept me informed about his status and behavior. The reports suggested that Marcus was struggling with the reality of incarceration, having difficulty adapting to the loss of freedom and privilege that had characterized his previous life. The woman who had trusted her husband's explanations and accepted his stories about business travel was gone, replaced by someone who understood that strength came from facing difficult truths rather than avoiding them. The family that had been built on deception and maintained through willful ignorance had been replaced by relationships founded on honesty and mutual respect. Marcus had taught me, inadvertently but thoroughly, that some people cannot be trusted with the important things in life. His betrayal had been devastating when I discovered it, but it had also been liberating in ways that became more apparent as time passed. I was no longer responsible for managing his moods, supporting his lies, or compensating for his weaknesses. The children had learned similar lessons in age-appropriate ways, understanding that actions have consequences, and that people who make bad choices must accept responsibility for the results. They had seen their mother transform from victim to victor, demonstrating that difficult situations could be overcome through intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking. Emma and James rarely mentioned their father anymore, not because they had forgotten him, but because his absence had become normal, and his presence was no longer necessary for their happiness or security. They had adapted to life as a single-parent family with remarkable grace, focusing on the relationships and activities that brought them joy, rather than dwelling on what they had lost. The financial security that Patricia's legal strategies had protected continued to provide opportunities and stability that would have been impossible if Marcus's debts and obligations had been allowed to affect our assets. The children's education funds remained intact, our house was owned free and clear, and my own earning potential was increasing as I progressed through my business degree program. But the most valuable outcome of this entire experience had been the discovery of my own capabilities and the development of skills I had never known I possessed. The strategic thinking that had enabled me to orchestrate Marcus's downfall had also served me well in rebuilding our lives and planning for our future. The business courses I was taking had introduced me to concepts and techniques that I applied to every aspect of our family's management and development. I approached parenting, financial planning, and career development with the same systematic methodology that had proven so effective in dealing with Marcus's betrayal and its consequences. 2 years after Marcus's imprisonment began, I graduated with my business degree and accepted a position with a consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses recover from financial difficulties and management problems. The irony of using skills I had developed while dealing with my husband's crimes to help other people solve their business problems was not lost on me, but it felt like an appropriate use of hard-won expertise. The children attended my graduation ceremony with pride and excitement that reflected their understanding that my education represented our family's commitment to growth and improvement. They had watched me study late into the evening and work on projects during weekends, learning that achievement required dedication and effort rather than just good intentions. Emma and James had also learned that their mother was capable of success in the professional world as well as the domestic sphere, providing them with a model of female capability and independence that would serve them well in their own future relationships and career decisions. Marcus was scheduled for release in 18 months, but the conditions of his probation would make it unlikely that he could rebuild any meaningful relationship with the children, or achieve the kind of financial recovery that would allow him to support himself independently. His restitution obligations alone would consume the majority of any legitimate income he might earn, leaving him with barely enough resources for basic survival. The private investigator Patricia had retained continued to monitor Marcus's situation and provide updates about his adjustment to imprisonment and his preparations for eventual release. The reports suggested that Marcus remained focused on his own problems rather than developing genuine understanding of the harm he had caused others, making rehabilitation unlikely even after he completed his sentence. But Marcus's future was no longer my concern or responsibility. I had successfully separated our family's well-being from his choices and circumstances, creating a life that was independent of his success or failure. Whatever happened to Marcus after his release would affect him alone rather than contaminating the lives of innocent people who had already suffered enough from his decisions. The hotel receipts that had started this entire journey remained in my jewelry box, but they had been transformed from symbols of betrayal into evidence of my own capacity for strategic thinking and decisive action. They represented the moment when I had stopped being a victim and started being a victor, changing the trajectory of our lives through intelligence and patience rather than emotion and impulse. Looking back on that morning when I had discovered those receipts while sorting Marcus's laundry, I could barely recognize the woman I had been then. She had been trusting to the point of naivete, willing to accept explanations that served Marcus's interests rather than seeking truth that served her own. The transformation that had followed that discovery had been complete and irreversible. The children had grown up watching their mother evolve from someone who reacted to circumstances into someone who controlled them. They had learned that victims could become victors, that intelligence was more powerful than deception, and that justice might be delayed but would ultimately be served to those who worked strategically toward that goal. Emma and James were now teenagers who understood the difference between people who could be trusted and people who made promises they had no intention of keeping. They had developed strong moral compasses that would protect them from the kind of manipulation and deception that had characterized their father's approach to relationships. Most importantly, they had learned that their mother was someone who could protect them from harm and provide security even under the most difficult circumstances. The strength I had discovered during our family's crisis had become a permanent part of my identity, something the children could depend on regardless of what challenges the future might bring. The house where we lived was the same building where Marcus had conducted his affairs and planned his deceptions, but it had been transformed into something entirely different through the removal of his presence and influence. The rooms that had once echoed with his lies now resonated with truth, laughter, and the sound of a family that had learned to thrive without him. As I tucked those hotel receipts back into my jewelry box, for what I knew would be the final time, I understood that they had served their purpose completely. They had revealed Marcus's true character, provided the foundation for his downfall, and demonstrated my own capacity for strategic thinking and decisive action. The woman who had discovered them was gone, replaced by someone stronger, smarter, and more capable than I had ever imagined possible. The family that had been built on his lies had been rebuilt on truth, and the future that had once seemed so uncertain was now filled with possibilities that reflected our own choices rather than his limitations. Marcus had given me the greatest gift possible through his betrayal. He had forced me to discover who I really was when everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be false. That discovery had been painful, but ultimately liberating, revealing strengths and capabilities that might have remained hidden if our marriage had continued in its comfortable deception. The hotel receipts had changed everything, but not in the way Marcus had intended when he carelessly left them in his pockets. They had destroyed his life and rebuilt mine, proving that sometimes the most devastating discoveries can become the foundation for the most complete victories. Justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and truth had ultimately triumphed over deception in ways that would endure long after Marcus's crimes were forgotten. The story that had begun with betrayal had ended with transformation, and that transformation was permanent, irreversible, and complete. 5 years had passed since Marcus walked out of federal prison, and the man who returned to our city bore little resemblance to the confident executive who had once commanded respect in boardrooms and social gatherings. The years of incarceration had aged him dramatically, leaving him gaunt and hollow-eyed, moving through the world with the cautious demeanor of someone who had learned that every step could lead to consequences he couldn't control. I encountered him unexpectedly at Emma's high school graduation ceremony, where he sat alone in the back row wearing a threadbare suit that had seen better days. His hair had gone completely gray, his shoulders were permanently hunched, and his hands trembled slightly as he applauded our daughter's achievements from a distance that seemed to encompass far more than the physical space between us. Emma had grown into a remarkable young woman, her artistic talents earning her a full scholarship to one of the country's most prestigious art schools. She moved across the stage with confidence and grace, accepting her diploma and academic honors with the poise of someone who had never doubted her own worth or potential. The little girl, who had once asked why Daddy seemed so sad, had become an accomplished teenager who rarely mentioned her father at all. James, now 16, had developed into a natural leader whose integrity and compassion set him apart from his peers. His success in academics and athletics reflected the values we had cultivated in our home, where honesty and hard work were rewarded rather than the manipulation and shortcuts that had characterized Marcus's approach to life. Neither child acknowledged their father's presence at the graduation ceremony, not out of deliberate cruelty but because his existence had become irrelevant to their daily lives and future plans. They had grown up understanding that some people chose to forfeit their right to be part of important moments through their own actions and decisions. After the ceremony, Marcus approached me hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked if we could speak privately. The man who had once demanded attention and respect now seemed afraid to take up space or make requests that might be denied. His transformation was so complete that I barely recognized him as the person who had once shared my bed and my dreams. We walked to a quiet corner of the school parking lot, where Marcus began what sounded like a prepared speech about his remorse, his efforts at rehabilitation, and his desire to rebuild some kind of relationship with Emma and James. His words were carefully chosen, reflecting years of therapy and counseling that had taught him the language of accountability without necessarily instilling genuine understanding of his impact on others. But there was something performative about his apology, a quality that suggested he was reciting lessons learned in prison, rather than expressing authentic emotion. Marcus had always been skilled at saying what people wanted to hear, and even his supposed reformation seemed calculated to achieve specific outcomes, rather than arising from genuine personal growth. I listened without interruption as Marcus described his current circumstances. He was living in a studio apartment across town, working night shifts at a warehouse loading dock, and sending every available dollar to satisfy the restitution requirements that would follow him for the rest of his life. His days were structured around work, mandated therapy sessions, and probation meetings that monitored his activities and associations. The man who had once traveled to luxury hotels and expensive restaurants now rode the bus to work and bought groceries with carefully counted cash. His world had shrunk to the bare necessities of survival, with no room for the indulgences and adventures that had once motivated his criminal behavior. When Marcus finished speaking, he looked at me with eyes that seemed to plead for some kind of absolution or acknowledgement that his suffering had been sufficient punishment for his crimes. But I felt no sympathy for his reduced circumstances, only a cold satisfaction that justice had been served thoroughly and permanently. I told Marcus that our children were thriving without his presence in their lives, that they had learned to associate security and happiness with his absence rather than his participation. Emma was preparing for college with excitement and confidence, while James was developing into the kind of young man that parents hope their sons will become. Neither child had expressed any interest in rebuilding a relationship with their father, and I would not pressure them to forgive someone who had never truly earned forgiveness. Marcus's face crumpled as I explained that his role in our family had ended the day he chose to betray us, and that no amount of time or rehabilitation could restore what he had willingly destroyed. The consequences of his actions would continue indefinitely, not because I was vindictive, but because some damage could not be repaired regardless of the perpetrator's subsequent regret. The conversation ended with Marcus walking away alone, returning to the empty life he had created through his own choices. I watched him disappear into the crowd of families celebrating their children's achievements, a solitary figure whose presence would not be missed by anyone who mattered. Later that evening, as we celebrated Emma's graduation with friends and extended family, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment of triumph and joy. The young woman who was preparing to enter college as a confident, accomplished artist bore no resemblance to the confused child who had once wondered why her father seemed so troubled and distant. Emma had grown up watching her mother transform from victim to victor, learning that strength came from facing difficult truths rather than avoiding them. She had developed a keen ability to recognize authenticity in others, a skill that would protect her from the kind of manipulation and deception that had characterized her father's approach to relationships. James had learned similar lessons about integrity and consequence, understanding that people's actions revealed their true character more clearly than their words or promises. He had watched his father lose everything through poor choices, and had absorbed the understanding that success required consistent ethical behavior rather than short-term cleverness. Both children had thrived in an environment where truth was valued over convenience, and where their mother's strength provided security that had never existed during their father's presence in our home. They had learned to trust their own judgment, to expect honest communication from the people in their lives, and to walk away from relationships that failed to meet their standards for integrity and respect. The business I had built over the past several years had grown into a respected consulting firm that specialized in helping organizations recover from leadership failures and ethical breakdowns. The skills I had developed while dealing with Marcus's betrayal had proven valuable to clients who needed someone capable of strategic thinking under pressure and systematic problem-solving in crisis situations. My professional success had been built on the foundation of personal transformation that began the morning I discovered those hotel receipts in Marcus's laundry. The woman who had once defined herself through her husband's achievements had become someone whose own accomplishments stood independently and commanded respect in their own right. The house where we lived had been completely transformed over the years, renovated and redecorated to reflect our family's new identity and priorities. The rooms that had once echoed with Marcus's lies now served as spaces for Emma's art projects, James's study sessions, and the gatherings of friends who valued the warmth and authenticity of our home environment. The financial security that Patricia's legal strategies had protected continued to provide opportunities and stability that allowed all of us to pursue our goals without the constraints that might have limited other single-parent families. Emma's art education was fully funded, James's college prospects were unlimited, and my own professional development continued to open new doors and possibilities. As the evening wound down and our guests departed, Emma approached me with a thoughtful expression that suggested she had been processing the events of the day carefully. She thanked me for the strength and stability I had provided throughout her childhood, acknowledging that she understood how difficult it must have been to rebuild our lives after her father's betrayal. Emma told me that she had never felt deprived or disadvantaged by growing up in a single-parent home, that her childhood had been filled with love, support, and opportunities that many of her friends with two-parent families had never experienced. She had learned to value authenticity over appearances and substance over style, lessons that would serve her well in her adult relationships and career choices. James joined our conversation, expressing similar gratitude for the example I had set and the values I had instilled in both children. He understood that his father's absence had been a blessing rather than a loss, allowing him to develop his character without the negative influence of someone whose moral compass had proven so fundamentally flawed. Both children acknowledged that they had occasionally wondered what their lives might have been like if their parents had remained married, but they had concluded that the stability and happiness they had experienced as a result of Marcus's removal from our family had been worth whatever they might have gained from his continued presence. The conversation reinforced my conviction that the systematic destruction of Marcus's life had been justified not by a desire for revenge, but by the need to protect innocent people from someone whose choices consistently prioritized his own desires over the well-being of others. The hotel receipts had revealed not just an affair, but a pattern of selfishness and deception that would have continued to damage our family if left unchecked. Standing in our living room, surrounded by the evidence of our successful rebuilding effort, I understood that Marcus's betrayal had ultimately been a gift that had forced me to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and to build a life that was entirely my own rather than a supporting role in someone else's story. The woman who had discovered those receipts and felt her world collapse had been replaced by someone who understood that true security came from her own capabilities rather than from dependence on people who might choose to betray that trust. The family that had been built on Marcus's lies had been rebuilt on truth, creating relationships that were stronger and more authentic than anything we had experienced during his presence in our lives. Emma and James had grown up watching their mother demonstrate that victims could become victors through intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking rather than through emotional outbursts or dramatic confrontations. They had learned that justice might be delayed but would ultimately be served to those who worked systematically toward that goal while maintaining their own integrity throughout the process. The hotel receipts had changed everything, revealing Marcus's true character while simultaneously demonstrating my own capacity for strategic planning and decisive action under pressure. They had provided the foundation for his complete downfall while serving as the catalyst for our family's transformation and growth. Marcus had underestimated me completely, assuming that his intelligence and sophistication would always be superior to what he perceived as domestic simplicity and naivete. His arrogance had been his fatal weakness, leading him to believe that he could maintain his deceptions indefinitely without facing meaningful consequences. But the woman he had dismissed as powerless had proven capable of orchestrating his systematic destruction while maintaining the appearance of innocence throughout the process. The strategic thinking he had failed to recognize in his wife had ultimately proven more effective than all of his careful planning and elaborate lies. The story that had begun with betrayal and deception had ended with truth and justice, demonstrating that sometimes the most devastating discoveries could become the foundation for the most complete victories. Marcus had written his own ending through his choices, while I had simply ensured that ending was as thorough and permanent as the betrayal that had started it all. Looking back on that morning when I had found those hotel receipts, I could see clearly that it had been the first day of my real life, the moment when I had stopped being defined by someone else's expectations and started building something that was entirely my own. The pain of discovery had been transformed into the strength of victory, and that transformation had been permanent, irreversible, and complete. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.